Greene County Fair. Jerry Roberts and I are, I think we think this is our 6th year of hosting history chats. All kinds of topics. I think most of you have been in here for one kind or another over the time. And one of the reasons we do this is our inspiration of the Greene County Historical Society goes back to Mr. History, James H. Andrews, who once told me that if you're going to present history and you expect people to pay any attention to it, it better be fun. And so that's been sort of what we've done here. We kind of do informal history here, but many times we've heard ideas come out of this that have triggered programs in the future for the Historical Society. And we always appreciate that and coming up with ideas. So the topic we're going to do this morning was we have a fantastic new exhibit at the museum uptown called Dig It, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And we should say right now, Jan Durlam, Chris Durlam have both worked hard on this. Mickey Schwarzkopf and Diane People did the research and a lot of the designing and planning of the exhibit. It's really terrific. If you haven't been there, get a chance and go. And last Saturday, to kind of kick that off, we had a panel discussion at the museum on the launch of the new exhibit and then we went into the 50s, 60s, and 70s and started drawing out people on how the 3 decades were in their lives, or how they knew it impacted their parents or their grandparents even. We had a huge crowd at the museum. It was just terrific. Rick Moraine was on the panel, and we'll have him help draw out this story this morning. The reason we brought this to the fair is we thought this is going to be a continuing discussion next year. We're going to have a couple more panel discussions. The couple we have planned now, or that we're planning now, are the movements that came out of that era. There were a lot of movements: the peace movement, the civil rights movement, many others. The American Indian movement. American Indian movement started then. The women's movement, various ag movements started up in that time. So things that really have changed our lives ever since. So that's going to be one panel discussion coming. And the other one's going to be on the music of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because we think that was so important to life in general. It really did change music and everything else. So we'll have a couple of real musicians who are going to talk and sing their way through songs of the 30 years, and they're really excited about it. Heath Patchell and Justin Apple, who are both from Des Moines and perform all over the state all the time. They're both performing at Adventureland all summer this summer. So they'll be up here sometime in the fall and winter. So we wanted to continue this today to hear your stories, hear your impressions of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, the truth is, the idea for this came from, at our museum, like most county museums, I would guess, around the state, our displays have been from basically pioneer times, settlement times, up through World War II for sure, and into the 50s. And then we sort of, thought modern times started then. But we started thinking about in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which produced most of us sitting in here in this audience this morning, it seems like current times because it's us. But the fact is, we're history. And the 50s, 60s, and 70s were 70 years ago and more, and that's really history. And so that's what led to this. But because we're so biased on this, and it's our story of our time, to me, this is sort of holy history. And because it's holy, it should start with a prayer. Now, I'm not going to really have a prayer. I'm going to have a litany. And here's the litany. You heard that the title of the whole program, Dig It, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So, this is how we started last week at the museum, too. I'm going to go through the litany, and I'm going to say words that came out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And when I say these words, you answer, dig it. Okay? So here we go. Hepcats, Square. He's such a square.
Dig it.
Cool. She's cool.
Dig it.
Or she's hot.
Dig it.
They're hoods. They're hoodlums. They're hoods.
Dig it.
Ducktail haircuts.
Dig it.
Duck butt haircuts.
Dig it.
Fender skirts.
Dig it.
Burn rubber.
Dig it.
Going steady.
Dig it.
Nerds.
Dig it.
What a drag, man.
Dig it.
Slip me some skin.
Dig it.
Groovy. We're grooving. Groovy.
Dig it.
Peace out.
Dig it.
And my favorite, far out.
Dig it.
There we go. We've heard a lot of reactions as we cranked this up, and this whole exhibit and everything else. And one of my favorites came from Larry Devine. He's the editor emeritus over at the Daily Times, or the Times Herald in Carroll. Great guy. He's from this era. And when I sent him some news releases on all of this, he emails me back and he says, "Looks like fun. I cringed today thinking of some of the striped, flared pants I wore, and of course boots. But I don't apologize for the paisley shirts. I think I had some really nice ones." Paisley shirts. He's probably still wearing them, isn't he? But, so we're going to proceed into this, and the way we did this at the museum, I wrote up what are basically kind of primers for each of these decades, things that I knew that happened globally, nationally, in Iowa, right here in Greene County, just to start the discussion. And we're going to go through each of those decades, and this will be a conversation, so you can speak up whenever something inspires you, just raise your hand. Some of you will appear in this, but we started each decade, and we regret we don't have a piano that works well enough here today, but we drafted Rick Moraine, who can play anything on the piano. And we said, okay, I want one, maybe two songs from each decade that represent where music was as we went into that decade and where it was going, okay? So let's start off with the 1950s. Rick, what song did you pick to represent the 1950s?
I played Fats Domino, I'm in Love. I sang that. That was
Give us a few bars.
Yes, it's me and I'm in love again. And no loving since you know when. You know I love you. Yes, I do. And I'm saving all my love just for you.
Oh, fantastic. So that'll carry us into the 1950s. And here's your primer for the little discussion here. The 1950s. We started that decade with 8 high schools in Greene County. And we finished the decade with the first of the life-changing school consolidation. Now there are 2 high schools here. The Sheridan Gremlins made it to the Iowa High School Girls State Basketball Tournament, and people still talk about the 1952 Jefferson High School football team that went 9-0 and was the only prep team in America that held all opponents scoreless. The Korean War erupted and concluded. The Soviet Union launched the space satellite Sputnik, and U.S. schools scrambled to catch up in science. Rock and roll revolutionized the music world, and again, we'll pinpoint the exact time when that new music arrived in Greene County. Call coming. Nearly all of us got televisions, and some offices and even homes got air conditioning. The county's centennial was held in 1954. U.S. Highway 30 was moved from its historic route across the county to a new highway across all our towns, and businesses died as a result, although a few new ones were created too. The countryside started to look a little different with the federal government creating the soil bank. The Iowa Hawkeyes played in 2 Rose Bowl football games in '57 and '59 and won both. Our Jim Doran, who didn't even play football in high school, was starring as a receiver for the Detroit Lions football NFL team. And we could barely believe it was happening, but in 1959, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the enemy nation in that Cold War era, was motorcaded across southern Greene County on his way to a historic visit to learn about agriculture at the farm of Roswell and Elizabeth Garst outside Coon Rapids. Then as the decade closed, the Cuban Revolution broke out, and there was so much more that led us into the 60s, where we'll go next. So the 1950s, Bruce McDonald. Craig McDonald, geez, where'd I get Bruce come from?
He's a track guy.
Oh, he is?
Yeah,
Okay.
he was a fast kid.
He's gonna be mentioned in here.
Does it say what year they paved the 30? Was it 59?
59 is right.
That's what I had, 59 in my mind.
Alan Robinson did a wonderful program. Alan Robinson's from Greene County, and he did a wonderful program for us a few years ago up at Peyton, as I recall, on the impact of Highway 30, what it did in the town. But one of the interesting things is it was at the Iowa Highway Commission back then. I think that may be the agency that did that. And the Iowa Highway Commission, as they were going out to tell towns what was coming with this new Highway 30 going across, put out this video about how this was going to save rural America. And I mean, it was propaganda worthy of the Soviet Union. It was amazing to see that. And if you ever run into Alan, he probably has a copy of that. Watch that video, because it just it's just going to be the salvation of all our towns and
They
everything.
kind of misled us, didn't they?
Huh?
They kind of misled us.
Yeah, except, you know, we talked about last Saturday, really we wouldn't be, I mean, it hurt us in some ways, it helped us in so many other ways, because, you know, the population was becoming increasingly mobile. And so you wanted safe conveyance to Iowa State and to Omaha and, you know, every place else. So we needed the safer, bigger highways, so. Jerry, what else from the 50s? What strikes you? What jumps out at you?
But we lost our family cherry tree.
Oh, you did? That's a big deal.
It was. It was right outside the back door. And my dad had this great idea that because we had an apple tree, and this didn't make sense, but because we were going to chop down the cherry tree, we needed a place to put fresh fruit and vegetables. So we chopped down the cherry tree. So we decided to dig a cave. And so my dad and I did the digging, and we did the bricklaying, and called in the cement people, and they poured the floor. And also, we built a dome for it, and cemented it up, and covered it up, and there outside the back door was this fruit and vegetable cave. Now it also had access for breathing. We could stay down there 3 weeks if we had to. And all of a sudden it was not really a vegetable and fruit cave. It was a bomb shelter that we had done. Because during the week we were dropping underneath your desk and all of that. It was the Cold War, and that was a very thinly veiled attempt to turn a food cave into a bomb shelter. So,
and when you think about that, honestly, we sort of snicker about that idea of the bomb shelters now, but I remember as a kid, it was scary. I was down in southwest Iowa growing up, and we had Strategic Air Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, and we used to debate if the Soviets dropped the big bomb on SAC at Omaha, would we be in the hole in Shenandoah, or would we be in just the radiation zone? I mean, as a kid growing up, they were talking about that stuff. It's just amazing.
Don't you remember at night they didn't want your lights, kept your lights down or
Oh yeah,
curtain shut so you couldn't see?
amazing.
there were radar stations all across Iowa.
Yeah.
I remember as a Cub Scout going and visiting a radar station down at Dallas Center.
We thought we were going to have air raids any minute.
Yeah, it was just, I'll bet there's 20, 30 radar stations around the state. Civil Air Patrol outfits.
Were these very big, Jerry? I can't remember.
The whole outfit wasn't any bigger than this building, but it was kind of broken down into a couple different buildings. There was administration, and then I remember walking in and seeing first of all, seeing the fan outside going around, and then seeing them plotting, making plots of aircraft going across Iowa on this big plexiglass board. And,
Plane spotters.
yeah.
The 50s also, you know, 70 years later, have a reputation of being a calm, normal time. It was sort of Ozzie and Harriet, you know, and it was Dwight David Eisenhower, post-war. calming everything down. And we talked about last Saturday at the larger discussion about how, honestly, we really needed that. Because when you think about the population, not just in the United States, but everywhere, population had been in the 30s, had been through the Great Depression. I mean, and that was just devastating. And then World War II, just even more devastating, completely changed everything, turned life upside down. We needed a time to just calm down. Which, if you remember this way, you're growing up and you graduated from high school in 59.
Yeah, 50's were a very calm time. Most of us in school didn't worry about national problems, what you're talking about, who's going with who and why they break up.
You could even take your gun to school, Rick. In the back of your car, the kids had their hunting guns.
Yeah, you could do that.
Yeah, I mean, it was common.
Any other thoughts on that? Just the tone of the 1950s?
The soldiers that came back from World War II, the white soldiers came back and re-entered their communities pretty easily. The black soldiers came back and were still segregated.
Yeah.
They came back as people who had helped save the nation, who were treated as though they were scum.
Yeah.
There was a big difference right after World War II of how Japanese people were treated in the United States and German people were treated in the United States. In Wisconsin, we had 2 or 3 different sites where there were German soldiers kept in farm areas, and they were hired out to work in fields. The Japanese were not treated that way at all. They were treated very, very poorly. So those are also things that were going on during the 50s. How that segregation was still going on.
And also kind of starts triggering the civil rights movement. I mean, it figures into that. So,
The Depression in Iowa didn't really start in the 30s.
Yeah.
The mid-20s on, after the very high crisis in World War I. Ag prices bottomed out because there wasn't a market.
in
So
28,
ag trouble started in the mid-20s.
and that's when the bank collapse happened in Greene County, right?
In the late
20s,
20s,
yeah.
early 30s.
Amazing. We heard about that yesterday. We were talking about the community of Rippey as it's in its sesquicentennial year. And actually, when the bank holiday, federal government had bank holidays to try to stabilize the economy and closed all the banks, the only 2 of those banks that reopened soon afterwards were the 2 Rippey banks, which
The next day, I think.
they've always been proud of yet down there.
In Jefferson, Milligan Brothers, lumber and grain printed script, and that was used as a
So, we had all this good, normal, calming down happening in the 50s, and then as Andy McGinn said last week, because Andy is a young man, but he has researched this whole era. He's done a whole lot of stories on history. This is the editor of our Jefferson Herald newspaper. Andy McGinn said, and then the devil's music arrived. Rock and roll came, and I had challenged Andy out here 2 years ago. We did a thing on rock and roll and music in Greene County. And back then I had challenged Andy. I said, Andy, you're good at research. You're digging all the time. I want to know when rock and roll arrived in Greene County. And I'm not talking about the decade, or I'm not talking about the year. I want to know the date when it arrived in Greene County. Figure out when we can date rock and roll arriving in Greene County. And the answer is, from the editor this morning, is he doesn't have his notes right in front of him at home, but it was on a Sunday in August of 1955, 2 p.m., when the show Blackboard Jungle rolled at the Iowa Theater, which is now the Sierra Theater, and the theme song was Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. And Andy said that there was references in the paper that when that show ran that Sunday afternoon, he said, apparently young people, the theater was packed and the young kids went nuts. They just went crazy. And yesterday afternoon, D. O'Brien band walked and she said, I was there. I was at that show, and she said, I looked at that screen and I said to myself, my parents are going to hate this. And it just took off from there. And
She would have been 13.
can you tell Andy's story about, we had a sudden star develop in Greene County right then. He was
Claire Tomlinson. Lived up on North Cedar Street. His dad drove heavy equipment. And Claire was in my grade. He was class of 10.
yeah.
And Claire, throughout his school career, thought of himself as kind of a backbencher. You know, didn't have a big crowd of friends. Just kind of kept to himself until he discovered Elvis Presley and figured out that he could imitate Elvis Presley.
Oh my God.
And he got a guitar, and Claire was built kind of like Elvis, you know, long and slim, and long legs, and he had one of those ducktail haircuts, which he kind of fashioned into an Elvis haircut. And back then, after Elvis hit, there were Elvis Presley imitation contests all over, and Claire won the county thing. And then the winners, like the state fair, you know, the fair queen goes down to the state fair. They took all the Elvis Presley imitators down to Des Moines to the Bel Air Ballroom and had a contest. And by gosh, Claire won the state contest.
Oh wow.
And he came home and he was God. Claire Tomlinson, we called him Spider because he was so skinny. One of the football coaches called him Spider after he lined up over the ball and they saw his legs about that big. So his nickname was Spider. Spider Tomlinson became a hero.
And Andy's written a good bit about him later on. He found him down in Arizona. And he was in the Air Force.
Yes.
And he was on one of the missile crews down in the silos back in the time.
I got one more quick Claire Tomlinson story. Back then we had 2 sections of every class in my grade. We didn't, the big push, the big burgeoning of students came after the war. That was the baby boomer group, some people. But I was born 6 months before Pearl Harbor. And my classes were small, so we had 2 sections all the way through first. In the morning, for kindergarten, kindergarten classes were arranged alphabetically. The first part of the alphabet went in the morning, the second part went in the afternoon. Claire's mom fixed him a little sack lunch. He walked down to the pink school, what used to be up there. And he walked in, and Miss Mabel, the kindergarten teacher, said, Claire Tomlinson, your last name begins with T. You can't be here today. You go on home. Come back this afternoon. Claire said, I'm the only kid I know who was ever kicked out of kindergarten the first day.
Oh, that reminds me, in the 50s, maybe into the 60s, but I think in the 50s in particular, release time from school to go to church at like mid-morning on a Thursday or something like that. Wednesday, whatever. That soon was no longer happening, but it sure happened back in the 50s. Amazing. Anything more on the 50s?
Yeah.
Go.
I got a couple things. First of all, I got a history of rock and roll.
That book is invaluable.
It is.
The Rolling Stone magazine's illustrated history of rock and roll. It's got great pictures through it.
It was a kinder, gentler time. We were introduced to families, and of course every family had single beds in the bedroom to keep it just on the up and up. There was Ozzie and Harriet's. There were a whole lot of people like that. And my wife collects little aprons.
Oh,
And the
sweet.
women of the house would entertain.
Put it on.
I will. I'll put it on. I'm not. I'll wrap it around. But they would have card clubs. Canasta was a big deal. I don't know if you or your parents know about Canasta, but there would be card clubs. And they would come, and the women would entertain. and of course, it was a special time. They got out their glass plates and the little cups that fit in the hole were the cups for their coffee, and they made salads and all sorts of things, and they wore their pretty little apron.
I have been, this sounds a whole
There's a
lot.
half a tutu, right?
It is, yeah. No, that's fine. I'm good.
This sounds like Betty Molly. Every time I hear a story about that, I think of the stories. This was in your time in Cooper, but way before I got there. We had the Franklin Culture Club in Cooper. Were you a member of that?
Yeah.
And it was, I always thought, what a great name for a club, Franklin Culture Club. And I have campaigned that we should resurrect that and have it again, except it should be co-ed now. So Stephen can come too, and I can come too. And we should do cultural kinds of things like that. And Karen Lawton, who says she was the last president of the Franklin Culture Club, says it just won't work because if we get all those people together again, we're just going to break down in arguments. In some ways, I like the kinder, gentler 1950s.
There was also, when you're talking about the Aussies and Harriets and the kind of gentler, there was a whole lot of cowboys going on.
Oh, yeah.
In the 50s.
Hop along
And
there.
I must have a half a dozen of these, but I just grabbed the one that was handy. And there's Roy Roger mugs and all sorts of cowboys, Gene Autry, Kit Carson.
Tom Mix.
Well, he was before them.
Oh yeah, he was before, yeah.
Way before.
Okay,
One
okay.
quick story.
And who brought these? Oh my gosh, look at this.
You want to go through the
45 RPMs. This is how rock and roll arrived. And the first one I pick up is Kokomo on Earth, or that's one of the songs, Kokomo, and the other song is Earth Angel. Okay.
Okay, very quick.
Yep.
Remember the TV show Your Hit Parade?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Your Hit Parade started out in the very late 40s and the early 50s, at a time when popular songs could be sung by any musician, you know, the standard song. Sing them in different keys, but standard songs. But by the time rock and roll came, songs were identified with particular artists. And Your Hit Parade, the bottom dropped out because can you imagine Snooky Lanson singing Lucille by Little Richard? It just didn't work.
Yeah.
And they lost their base.
Lead us into the 1960s. What songs did you pick?
I did, you mean for the
For
show?
the show last week at the museum.
What did I do? I heard it on the grapevine
By,
by
Bunch of Grapes.
Marvin Gaye.
Marvin Gaye.
yeah, that was it. And that, explain some of the significance of picking that.
Well, in the 60s, there were several music movements that kind of grew out of rhythm and blues and rock and roll. And one was the Motown sound in Detroit. That was kind of a direct descendant from rhythm and blues and rock and roll.
And I heard it through the grapevine refers to what?
In the Civil War, that was the phrase, in the Civil War that slaves used because they didn't have access to the postal system or anything like that. So
Amazing.
the grapevine, you know, had grapes on a vine that goes along, and that was their phrase for how they got the message.
But he could not limit the 60s music to one song, because we also had to deal with the British invasion.
That's right.
And so to represent that, you picked an all-timer. First time I'm sure this has been played in a county historical museum in Iowa, if not the world.
I did the Rolling Stones, Honky Tonk Women.
And you refused to sing it because the lyrics were just too
Yeah. The little
stonish.
too blue. The Beatles, you could, as I said, you could hear them at a church picnic, but you wouldn't hear the Rolling Stones at a church picnic.
What's probably common today though.
No doubt.
Okay, the 60s. To stir your thoughts. This decade started out with so much life and fun. The Beatles, Vatican II, birth control pills. Scranton High School's Bruce McDonald ran wild in track. We learned that there was going to be something called the Mahaney Memorial Carillon Tower to be built right on the courthouse square in Jefferson. But then we went through a half dozen years that seemed to threaten the stability of life as we knew it. There were the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy. The civil rights movement, with help from churches and an aroused younger generation, began confronting racial inequality and oppression with huge rallies, marches, and protests, and the nation began to change. The music got angrier. The younger generation of Americans also went to war in Vietnam and other countries of Southeast Asia. The fighting lasted much too long, and the U.S. became dangerously divided over how long to continue a fight that wasn't really ours. Recreational drugs became a thing. The Beatles began their breakup. And watching over it all as the decade ended was the man on the moon. And so we advanced, hoping for calmer, better times in the 70s. So the 60s. Gosh, I already know where to start. I have said before, because that's when I graduated from high school, 1965, and then I went to Vanderbilt in Nashville. And I said it was an absolutely great time to go to college, maybe the best time to go to college, if you survived it. Because some didn't, but either from service in the military and fighting in Vietnam and getting killed or wounded, to dangerous drugs that nobody understood, but we were using anyway. It was crazy for times. And it was like we lost our mooring on a lot of things. Nothing seemed solid anymore. It seemed, really changing. And as I quoted an author, a friend of mine last week at the museum, Fry Gaylor, the guy who's written a lot about the 60s, it not only was happening out there, it seemed to be happening on every corner in all of our towns, in all of our lives. It was just like pervasive. So how do you all remember this? What do you, Jerry?
Yeah, I was at the University of Iowa. I was a 61 graduate from high school. And
We're trying to get over it. Go ahead.
But going into the Air Force for 4 years. Now, from the University of Iowa, I packed my gear to go to school, and I had sport coats and ties and shirts and dress pants and good shoes. And I went to class that way, because that's the way they went to class. So then I joined the Air Force for 4 years, and I spent some time in Germany and spent some time in Alaska, the United States. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the United States, but when I came back, so much had changed between 64 and 68. I got back to the University of Iowa. I packed my sport coat, and I came back with a little money in my pocket from the service, and I went and bought some clothes, and I'm ready to go to college, and I land at college, and I look around, and everybody's wearing jeans and sweatshirts and has beards and long hair, and it was like, the theater department really got big while I was gone. And it wasn't that the theater department got big, we had just changed. Now, during the time I was in the Air Force, I got stationed at Biloxi, Mississippi. And I was down there in 65. And that was a tumultuous time, and it's probably a tumultuous time for the Mississippians, and it was a tumultuous time for those of us who were just visiting through the Air Force. I remember being on a bus, and we had a guy that was from Detroit, a black soldier with us, and so we're sitting down, we're talking, laughing, and everything, and the bus driver says, "I'm not going to move the bus." Now this is 65. I'm not going to move the bus until he gets in the back. And we kind of looked around, not knowing what that was all about, but he said, "No, he's got to get in the back or I'm not moving this bus." And so we all got up and went to the back. He said, no, that's not going to, nope. He's got to stay there, you got to be up here. So we decided right there and then, us northern boys weren't messing with that. So we just sat there and all got arrested on disturbing the peace.
Amazing.
And so that's the kind of thing still going on in 65. They were still screaming and kicking about the change that had been I guess, dictated or that they're,
Civil War.
well, since the Civil War, they're still going down there on that, but it was a big change in the Southerners just weren't and aren't ready to change yet. So after that, I think I can draw it to there, but there would be a rock and roll, and they'd bring in a concert, they'd bring in black musicians, and the sheriff's department would surround the entryway to the concert or to the dance or to whatever was happening. And here's the reverse. They let all the black folks in, but turned away all the white folks. And took names and called them parents. So that's how a little reverse psychology was down there. They weren't discriminating against the black folk. They were turning the white folk away. At least that's the way it was in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Strange times. I want to get one more story, and it's very important locally. Something that also happened at the University of Iowa to Rick Moraine that has forever changed his life and has made him somewhat famous here for a certain item that he has championed since that time. We're referring to Rick Moraine glasses, the horn-rimmed black glasses that all of us in Greene County know. Where did this come from?
I used to have, when I first got glasses in 7th grade, all the way through high school, I had glasses that were kind of light brown on top and clear on the bottom. But when I went to college, when I transferred up to Iowa, in Graceland in 61, the movie Judgment at Nuremberg was showing in 62. And that's Spencer Tracy was in the movie. And toward the end, he was the prosecutor. And toward the end, he's interviewed by 2 American reporters who are over. And one of them had these glasses. And I thought, that guy looks really intellectual. I need to get some. So when I came home, the next time I went to Dr. Wake's, my optometrist, and ordered some of those, and I've had them ever since.
58 years.
No change.
They were, when Terry Brown became the optometrist, these glasses were made by a German company, and they went out of business. He knew they were going out of business, and he said, I'm going to stop at 3 extra pairs of those, because you're going to need them. So several years after that, I replaced my glasses.
Well, we all have great respect for him. We recognize you when you're on your way to us.
We hope they do their magic because we're still waiting for that intellectual.
No, it hasn't happened yet, but
What'd you say, Chris?
I wondered if he's got a third set yet, or
yeah, I'm on the third. In fact, these are kind of a reproduction from another company.
Stephen, I mentioned the soil bank program in the 1950s. In the 60s, does anything jump into your minds, particularly in farming, that we should mention, that notable impacts of changes in farming? Anything jump to mind?
Well, just about everybody took land in they call it the soil bank or the reserve, because you just about had to be in the program to make ends meet. You had to be able to, if you wanted to borrow money on your crop or something, you had to be in the program to do that. You were locked into it whether you liked it or not.
Do you think of, let's talk about equipment. Did the equipment start getting bigger in the 60s?
The equipment started getting bigger the time I started farming in the 40s.
I suppose so.
We planted corn, we were still planting corn with a team of horses, the 2-row planter.
You're kidding. Wow.
Oh yeah,
Planted up
in the 40s, yeah.
Up to the 50s with teams of horses.
And I bought a 4-row planter that went on to, you had to pull with a tractor. Things like that. Mechanization was was creeping in.
Right.
It creeped in and then all of a sudden it jumped in. All the horses died.
The one thing about the 60s, and I was down in Corning working at KSIB at the time, was the NFO.
Yeah.
Oh, there was real hard feelings in the farming community.
It's really big in Corning.
Yeah.
In the
that's our
60s.
headquarters.
Yeah, 60s,
That was
yeah.
in the 60s, and there were trucks being shot at because they were taking their produce or their product to the wrong place.
Part of that, that's what I mentioned in terms of the movements that started in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, that's one of them. You know, the farm movements that started to demand better market conditions and collective marketing, that kind of stuff.
The Cuban Missile Crisis also occurred in the 60s.
It started in 59, went right on into the 60s. Yeah, it was 62 was that was.
I remember working in a corn crow factory in Beloit, Wisconsin, and listing whether I would even graduate from high school as I think it was a junior, maybe a senior, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis going on, and whether we go to war.
I've gotten real interested in Cuba in recent years. I was there in 2017 and I've been fairly active on it, and I'm just distressed that we still have a blockade on Cuba after all these years, 60 years of blockade, and it's really hurt the Cuban people and denied us good trading partners in lots of business ways too. But it's interesting to me, now keep in mind I'm in college from 65 to 69, right after the Cuban Revolution, the Castro brothers, Che Guevara, and other lieutenants in that movement down there were kind of heroes of ours. I mean, they were young people who were changing their countries, and we thought they were cool, and so did most of the United States, because Johnny Carson was bringing them to New York and having them on the Tonight Show. I mean, they were really kind of popular figures, and then their own philosophies are evolving, they're young people, and they decided they're communists. And they announced that they were going to be a communist form of government, and boy, that just isolated them from the rest of the world. I'll tell you, I was down there 4 years ago. Let me skip that, because that gets too deep into Cuba. But it affected life here, I think, in many ways. Anybody got a sense of business around the square in the 60s? And how about you? Did you come back to the newspaper in the 60s?
67.
Okay.
And when I came back in Jefferson, there were more businesses and smaller businesses. Consolidation.
Mom and
was
pop
going on.
businesses.
Yeah, it was going on, but there were lots of mom and pop. There were,
We had no fast food restaurant, I assume.
no, didn't need them.
Yeah.
We had no supermarkets. There were a ton. Every other building was a grocery store.
Yep.
Downtown around the square.
Yep.
And that was the way it was in Perry, that's the way it was in Jefferson. I remember driving up here and getting my driver's license on my birthday.
And you drove up and got your driver's
I did.
license?
Good catch. Let's go. What did you pick to lead us into the 70s musically?
By the 70s, music had kind of splintered into lots and lots of different directions. And it would have been hard to pick a really classic number. So I went with, You've Got a Friend by Carole King and
James
Taylor.
Taylor. Which was amazing, because it was, when you played it last week at the museum, it kind of had moved from hard, pushy rock and roll to kind of a ballad almost,
Yeah.
a love song.
Yeah,
You know, I mean,
but there were several hard, pushy rock and roll, psychedelic type
well,
songs.
yeah, we start getting into heavy metal. I mean, did we start that early, maybe?
Love my baby.
Yeah.
But at any rate, the music.
There was a lot of folks that the rock and roll genre was getting too crowded. And
Yeah.
people started searching for something to stand out. And with so many folks going with reputable bands, what you had left was bangers and clunkers and loud music.
And
Let's go to the
there was an audience for every one of those. We haven't even mentioned folk music or
Yeah.
English music.
Right before the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was in the 60s
Yeah.
too.
Kingston Trio.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Peter Paul and Mary.
yeah, ooh. What a great record. Okay, the 70s. While the Vietnam War dragged on for 5 more years before it ended, America was seeing robust economic growth, including on Greene County's farms where productivity and profitability both mushroomed. The first hog confinement buildings were going up, and small new refineries began producing gasohol. The Iowa State Cyclones made it to their first football bowl game. There was the legendary blizzard of April 1973, in which most of Iowa received more than a foot of snow, and some locations measured more than 20 inches. Schools closed for a week, and the National Guard used its helicopters to drop bales of hay to cattle stranded out in the fields. In 1974, President Richard Nixon resigned, taken down by the Watergate scandal. In Iowa, the Democratic Party created and the Republican Party soon joined in on the Iowa political caucuses, and everybody in Iowa shook hands with Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. In local high school sports, Scranton High School's Rosemary Holden, now Hoyt, became one of Iowa's greatest track stars before going on to run for Iowa State University. And Jefferson High School's jazz band developed a national reputation under the direction of teacher Jack Oates, who brought some of America's leading jazz players to the school to lead clinics and festivals. In 1978, Peyton native Lauren Shriver, who'd been a combat pilot in the Vietnam War, was selected to become a NASA astronaut and eventually was on 3 space missions. Which reminds me, we kind of jumped over. It was Doreen Wilbur. It was 72 Olympics, so the 72 Olympics were Doreen's time too. Gold medalist from Jefferson, Iowa in archery. I mean, you just stop and you think about that. I see her statue every once in a while. I think she won the gold medal in the Olympics.
When that happened, we had the paper was already pretty much put together. And we got the call from Steve that she had won. So we tore down the front page and built a new one with the, I think it's on display at the.
It is,
Yes. With the target and Doreen's face in the middle of it. And the headline was, "It's gold for Doreen." And she came back, of course, we had the parade around the square and everything, and she was honored up in the bell tower. And I remember Skeeter, her husband, saying, "You know, it's great to live in a community where all you have to do is print somebody's first name and everybody knows."
That's an amazing story. The 70s were, Dave?
I was just gonna say that people should remember this, that when we dedicated the statue at the Civic Center, at the Recreation Center, National Guard, 2 National Guard jets had a flyover.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
So that was kind of exciting to,
I was just up at the museum and I was impressed by the fact the arrow was there.
One of the arrows she shot her.
For the 2 years, 71, 72, there they are.
Well, that's what I remember about it. She put on a demonstration up in the high school. They had the target over in one corner, her over in one corner of the stage. She stood clear over in the opposite corner. And she stacked them arrows right in there, so.
In the auditorium?
Yeah, well, she was on the stage, up on the stage. And I'll bet the arrows could have went in an area that big, going across there, just one after another, and she just stacked them in there right on top of each other.
She had no formal training as an artist. Skeeter, her husband,
Now,
taught her how to shoot. And she said the thing that she got her mind around doing it was she'd look at the bullseye until it got to be about that big, in her mind. She said, "I can't miss it." And then she
And the story, amazing story, was they started out, I mean, she didn't have a bow and arrow, and neither did Skeeter, her husband. But Skeeter had a car repair shop, and somebody couldn't pay their car repair bill and gave him a bow and arrow, a set of arrows, and he took it home and gave it to Doreen and said, "Maybe I'll try this." Astounding. That's a great, great story. Other 70s stories.
We went down to the launch of Lauren Shriver.
Oh, did you really?
Yes. is a cousin, his wife is a cousin of mine, and so consequently we went down and we stayed at the area where the rest of the family was staying, but the flight did not go off the day that it was supposed to go off. And so consequently, we all had plane tickets to come back home, and so consequently, the flight went off the next day, so we had to all extend our flights back to Des Moines because of the flight being canceled for one day.
Wow.
So, yeah, that was a tremendous experience. I'll never forget
He
that.
is such a, how old is Lauren Shriver today? Does anybody have a guess?
Well, he had his 50th class reunion, that was like 2 years ago, so he is in his 70s, he's retired.
I think.
But he does a lot of volunteer work in Estes Park, they live out in Colorado now, and he does a lot of volunteer work and Hedefords over and.
I think he graduated with the last class from Peyton High
Yes,
School.
he did.
that's right.
Yes, he did.
And still, I saw him do an assembly at the high school here maybe 3 years ago. And he came in and he connected with those high school students so well. I mean, you could hear a pin drop in there as he told his story. It was really amazing.
76.
76, wow.
You're right.
Yeah, he's all right.
Jerry, lead the troops here for a minute while I snap a couple pictures.
All right, 70's. You talked about some of the music. Did we have more branching into? We had heavy metal, you say, in the 70's. I remember people like Karen Carpenter and Cher and Sonny. And that was kind of mellow kind of music.
Yeah.
And here on one side, and then on the other side we had heavy metal.
Yeah, the Carpenters kind of grew out of the folk tradition. Joan Baez,
And the folk tradition was a protest.
Yes, well,
It was-
yes, but folk music, protest music, went way back into the 30s.
Yes.
The
Pete Seeger and some of-
economic protest.
Yes.
We have this bulletin from the museum. This is Nancy Tice reporting in, and she says her daughter Claire is going through the 50s, 60s, 70s exhibit at the museum right now, and she's having a ball figuring out the record player at the museum.
Jerry, how did you figure out what year this was? You had a plane crash in Iowa, the Buddy Holly was killed.
Buddy Holly.
Singer.
59 Mason City.
The day the music stopped.
That's the song.
Yeah.
I saw him at Fort Dodge at the Laramar that week before, Buddy Holly. And
Did you really? Wow.
yeah, it was cold. Oh, that's the thing I can remember about it. It was cold.
He had
Yeah.
blue glasses too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, yeah.
When did disco music start? Was it later into the 80s?
Later 60s, right? Jerry?
Later than that.
No,
I think-
70s, late 70s.
70s.
Late 70s, late 70s.
I just loved it.
I can imagine you would.
But there was a half-hour TV program, I think it was at 6:30, and I never missed it. The lights and the costumes were fabulous dancing. I loved them.
What's the name of that?
Oh, I don't know.
And more normal people like me,
Yeah.
I had trouble dancing starting with the jitterbug, and it never got a damn bit better. So,
Well, with disco, all you had to do is get up there and stand and move a little bit, and hey, you were cool.
it looks different when I get up and do that than when you get up and do that.
Disco music is not, if you break it down, it's not all that different from rock and roll.
No.
Basic rock and roll is 4 beats to the day. Boogie woogie, New Orleans boogie woogie is 8 beat music. And disco is 16 beats. You just double the number of beats, so you get that shape. Yeah.
Well, anything else about the 70s, Dave?
A sanctuary story.
Great. Yeah, Ragbri starts in
We
73, right?
went, 74, we went with a group, we lived in Illinois at the time. But we came back to Jefferson and went with a group from Jefferson on a bus. And I drove we rented a U-Haul truck to haul the bikes, and I drove the U-Haul truck to Omaha at Council Bluffs, and then we had to trade.
Who do you recall being on that?
Oh, boy, Neva Hageman
Oh, yes.
and several young people. We were young then. And about the second night into we rode one day, and I think the second night out of Omaha to Red Oak or I don't remember the town. But anyway, we were staying in the motel. We stayed in motels across Iowa on that trip. And we were staying in a motel, and Donald Call was in the next room for us. So the ride is over, and we're getting ready for a shower and all that, rest for the night, and we get a knock on the door. And open the door, and here's Donald Call, and says, "Do you have any shampoo?" So that's our insignificant story that we loaned Donald Call shampoo on the second
What
night of
was
St.
Mrs. Murphy's name?
Regina
Regina Murphy went to St. Joe's Church, right? And I got her in kind of a petite, tiny little woman. Yeah, right. Well, one year after Carla and I had moved here, and it was probably in about 2006 or 7, I was tied up on some project, and I couldn't go on RAGBRAI, or I at least couldn't start the week, and I was in a first-class pout about it. And I went to Mass that morning up at St. Joe's and went to coffee afterwards, and Mrs. Murphy was sitting there at the same table, and I did not know her well at all. But somebody said to me, he said, "Well, are you going on RAGBRAI?" And I said, "Oh, well, thanks for asking. I'm not going to be able to go at least until the end of the week because I got to do some work." And they said, "Well, did you know that Mrs. Regina Murphy here was a RAGBRAIer?" And I said, "No, I did not know that." I said, "When did you, Mrs. Murphy, when did you go on RAGBRAI?" And she probably said 1974. And I said, "Wow." And I said, "How did you like it?" She said, "It was the most fun thing I've done in my whole life." And I thought, God almighty, that is a great testimony to RAGBRAI. And I said, well, what about being out there among all those young people? And she said, "Well, I was younger myself. I had a good time out there. I even drank a beer." She said, "I don't drink beer." Yeah, I used that story a few times.
What year did RAGBRAI go through Cooper?
1980.
1980.
And that inspired this great Cooper Centennial a year later, 1981. Donald Call sat on the front porch of the house that's still there, it's a wreck, across from the church. And he sat on the front porch and wrote his column. And I've got the copy of his column that he wrote in there. And I remember the end of it. They were raving about, it was really the first time that a little town, and I'm talking 50 then, right? It was the first time that a little town had gone berserko at hosting RAGBRAI, and it had been successful, and it was a huge, everybody still talks, the old timers still talk about RAGBRAI and Cooper. And Donald Call's column, and it ended this way, it said, "Just goes to prove that if you just got 50 people in your town, that's enough if they're the right 50. God, that's great. And where it really impacted was Gerald Lawton and Terry Rich, who read that column and said, "God, what can we do next to keep the media coming back to Cooper?" Great. Well, listen, any parting thoughts?
Well, I brought some things here. You and your print media, there's a Gordon Gamut book there. You've got books. There's a Jack Shelley book, a book by Jeff Stein, who also wrote
History of broadcasting.
a whole lot, And so there was a lot of television going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that generated from the local studios. They didn't do that anymore. In fact, rock and roll got a good kick not only from the national dance parties on television, but there were local dance parties. WOI 13, they had their own version of bringing kids in and having them dance.
Yeah, sure.
So broadcasting was was in its heyday in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because they still used real people. And radio took a nosedive, and right now a radio station is only salesmen and a jukebox. There aren't any personalities anymore. There's no radio people. And if they're personalities, you don't want to listen to them.
No Jerry Roberts.
Well, thank,
Donald Cole was a great one for sayings, coming up with sayings. And one of them that I liked the best was, guys will watch anything on TV as long as they keep score.
well, thank you all for coming. I want to remind you as we sign off here, the exhibit is going to continue, it'll probably continue to build actually too, but it's going to continue at the museum for at least a year. I mean, we're going to keep that up and prominent because it seems to be very, very popular. A lot of people are coming in that haven't been in the museum in a long time, so we think it's going to be a really fun one. Get there and enjoy that. It's going to be fun. Dave?
Why don't you review the 2 programs that you have, like
I did earlier in the program. I did talk
the
about it.
music program sounds fantastic.
And the next actual program we'll have at the museum is on July 25th, Sunday afternoon. We have Professor Chuck Holden from Scranton, who's a history professor at St. Mary's College out in Maryland, and he's going to talk about history and among other things, about why it's suddenly become so controversial to teach history in our high schools and colleges. So it should be an interesting program that day at 2 o'clock. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the 50s, 60s, and 70s up at the museum.